Welcome to the Jay Show. This is Dr. Jay Smith with Dr. Andy Bannister. Now, Andy Bannister, we've known each other for a long time.
20 years, I think it is this year. 20 long years.
And we've been in and out of each other's lives. We've worked on the same committees. We've been in many of the same organizations. And we've also been working on Islam quite a bit.
That's right. I think it wasn't long after we first met that you certainly started work on your doctorate that I think has been going on for years and years and years and years.
It's just 6 years. He has no idea what I'm talking about. But anyways, this doctorate is only 6 years long. That's all I could or permitted. Let's talk about the historical problem.
Let's do that.
Because the historical problem is a specific problem because there is a classical model, isn't there, that we've always, of course there really has only been one narrative. The same narrative that they're teaching in school, the same narrative that we've had certainly all right through the
Well, that's right. I think one of the things that we were saying earlier that I think has interested me and interested you, right, is there's as you begin studying Islam academically, there's a lot of critical questions that quickly emerge. We've talked about those in previous shows. But one of the other things that really interests me is there are things that everybody assumes to be true about Islam that actually no one bothers stopping and checking. And when you go and check, actually it's not quite as clear as that.
Let's back up a bit and let's just talk about that classical model. Though.
Yeah,
this is the classical model. Muhammad was born in 570. Okay?
Well, again,
no one questions that. That he started receiving revelations in 610.
Again,
no one questions that.
that.
And from 610 to 622, the first 12 years in Mecca, no one questions that.
Again, no one questions that.
621, he's woken up in the middle of the night to go from Mecca up to Medina on the back of a winged horse, goes up through the seven heavens, and gets the 50 prayers, which he and Moses whittled down to 5 prayers. He returns back.
So on and so forth.
The Miraj, okay? 622, he then moves up to Medina with about 80, maybe 200 followers. And then from 622 to 632, the last 10 years of his life, then things really start getting a lot of impact, enormous amount of all violence. We see all the big raids that he does, about 29 that he involved in. We see the 3 major battles at Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, and the Battle of the Trenches. But this is the classical model. He then dies in 32 AD. And then
632 AD.
632 AD, and then he is taken over by Abu Bakr for 2 years, who dies peacefully. And it's during the time of Abu Bakr that the first recension, we talked about that in the episodes that we did earlier.
That's right.
Umar takes over for about 12 years, 634 to 646. He dies violently, and Uthman is then given power from 646 to 656. He dies violently, and then Ali is taken over from 656 to 661. That is known as the Rashidun period. That's that golden period of Islam.
That's correct.
That's the period of the rightly guided caliphs. That's the narrative that we've always been told, and that's how Islam began. We were told that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet in the Muhammad in that 22-year period, 610 to 632, not written down to the time of Abu Bakr. Even that had to be rewritten again at the time of Uthman. So by the time of Uthman, we have a Quran, we have a Prophet, and we have a place, Mecca, and we also have a story. We have a history. That's really the beginning, as we know it, of a historical Islam. Now, Muslims would always say that everybody was a Muslim. Abraham was a Muslim, Adam and Eve were Muslims, Jesus was a Muslim. That's not what we're going to talk about. We're talking about the narrative as what does the history say? Let's start with Mecca real quickly.
Yes.
How many times is Mecca referred to in the Quran?
From memory, it's just the once, right?
Surah 48, Ayah 24.
Lots of references to a holy city and place of prayer and these
the
kind
place
of
the Prophet.
And the place of the Prophet.
Lots of references to the Prophet.
In terms of the name, just
How many
the once.
times?
Just the once.
Well, the name of the Prophet himself.
Oh, Muhammad, sorry.
Times.
I thought it was, Yeah, 4 times for Muhammad, but for Mecca,
Surah
just
3,
the once.
Surah 33, Surah 47, and Surah 48. Those are the 4 references we have to the Prophet Muhammad. That's it. In the earlier episodes, we were talking about the formulaic material and how the stuff gets repeated. You have reference after reference, 7 different stories of Iblis and Adam. Even Iblis is spoken of more than Muhammad.
Well, many of the prophets in the Quran are spoken of more than Muhammad. So
Jesus,
Jesus,
over 90 times.
Abraham, let's go.
Seems to suggest maybe he's even more important than Muhammad. But certainly, let's come back to this idea of the historicity. So what we're looking for are places, names, events,
and dates.
Those are the 4 areas we're looking for.
And so one of the problems we have with the Quran straight away, as you just identified there, 2 of the major pieces for early Islam we've got problems with. Muhammad only mentioned 4 times, but there's no names, there's no dates, there's nothing that really roots the Quran.
Mecca only mentioned once?
Mecca only mentioned the once there, which given its alleged importance in early Islam, is at the very least a mystery.
Huge importance. If Abraham was there to rebuild the Kaaba.
Well, here's the thing, you come along and you read the Quran, and I think if you were to read the Quran and not have the background information that we have from the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, you'd have no way of knowing where these places were, what was going on at all, really.
But on Meccan trade and the rise of Islam, has she been discredited on that book?
Good question. Let's come back to Kroner. Let's talk about Gibson. So I confess I put Gibson in that category. I thought, oh, here we go again, and to go. But I thought the friend who sent it to me, I thought, good friend, I at least need to do the justice of reading this so I can say, well, interesting, but could be, which is where I put Kroner. Kroner to me falls into the interesting but could be category. After about 2 months of kind of reading Gibson's book on and off and working my way through it, I came to the rather embarrassing conclusion at the end that I think I 80% agree with him. I've got my academic hat on now. Academics never 100% agree with anything. He's pretty much convinced me. I've still got 1 or 2 questions.
Dan Gibson is not an academic. He doesn't have a doctorate behind his name.
So let's give a bit of background to Dan. Dan has lived and worked in the Middle East for decades.
1979
all the way through.
So he knows so about 25 years.
He knows the culture. He knows the languages.
Lived amongst them. Lived amongst the Bedouin. Traveled to every place he investigated. He physically was in these places.
He's done the groundwork.
He's an archaeologist.
But let's, in a sense, though, walk through my journey, because I think it's helpful for people, because when you hear a claim like Islam actually began in Petra, the natural reaction is to go, that's so ridiculous that it can't possibly be true. I mean, if I'm thinking particularly for Muslims watching this going, seriously? I mean, what, Andy and Jay, what have you been drinking? What's been in your coffee at lunchtime?
Diet Coke, sorry.
Actually, a Diet Coke and I had tea, so the answer is nothing. So let me tell you how he won me over. The first few chapters in Quranic geography, Dan does asked a question. That's a really good question that I never encountered someone asked before. He said, well, let's take the Quran and let's look at the geographical references. Let's look at the places that are mentioned. Particularly
65 of these.
Yeah, and particularly some of the tribes that are mentioned. The people of Ad, the people of Talmud, the people of Midian.
Talmud.
And the people of Midian, who feature quite heavily those previous civilizations. In fact, the Quran talks about those as previous civilizations that had experienced the judgment of Allah for.
Ad is referred to 23 times. This would be the biblical Uz. Talmud is referred to 24 times.
Exactly.
Midian is referred to 7 times.
But here's the interesting thing. The interesting thing about all of those place names, all of those peoples that are mentioned so frequently in the Quran, they're all up in the north.
Before we get to that,
we know where they are.
It's more than that, because this prophet, whose name is who we dare not name, this prophet, who he seems to whoever the writer of the Quran seems to keep forgetting, has contact with these people from Talmud almost on a daily basis. He's talking to them. He's engaging with them.
Well, it's not so much that, Jay.
It seems to suggest that he's very close to them.
Well, that's my point being. He seems to suggest he's very close to them. And on top of that, the remnants of their great civilizations seem to be all around, because Muhammad in his preaching, and there are verse passages in the Quran that seem to imply.
Or this prophet in his preaching. I'm going to keep hanging on that.
Hanging on that. The prophet in his preaching seems to be sort of saying, look at these ruins, look at these former, signs of this great civilization that's there no longer. If you don't follow Islam, if you don't worship Allah, the same could happen to you. So in other words, he seems to know these people, he seems to be in contact with these people, and clearly he seems to be living in the middle of where was their centre of power. This is where the problem begins.
This place that he's living in has a stream going through it, has a parallel stream, has clay, loam.
Okay.
Do you want to get into this? Because
let's come to that in a moment. I think separate those questions out. So
okay, before we do that, I'd like to put a map up, and we're going to put a map up on the screen as to where these places
are. So that's the first thing to begin with. Where is it?
Take a look at it. They should be right out of Mecca. They should be surrounding
where
this prophet lives. If Muhammad is the man, and if he's down in Mecca, take a look at the map and see where they are. Where are they, Andy?
They're all up in the north.
About 600 miles
way in the north from Mecca. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two is what you began leading us into there, Jay. There are descriptions of, let's rather than call it Mecca, let's call it the Holy City. There are descriptions of the Holy City that we see. The Quran has some allusions to this, but also when we begin reading early Islamic literature, like the Hadith and the Sirah and so forth, we read, as you said, the Holy City has a river running through it. It has agriculture going on. There are vineyards and fruit trees. There's loam.
It has olive trees.
Has olive trees.
Wait a minute. Stop and think that through.
Yeah.
Are there any olive trees outside of the Mediterranean?
This is the problem we get to. Not merely is there that question to go, none of those features match Mecca. There's not olive trees and viniculture and agriculture down there in Mecca. There's been limited archaeology done. We've got soil samples and core samples and such things. There's never been, as far as there's no river running through the middle of it, and it goes on and on and on. The descriptions of the Holy City there in the early Muslim sources themselves don't match where the present day Mecca.
Seems like we got the wrong man in the wrong place doing the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Yeah. And so you put that together And it begins to look a little bit suspicious. Then there's another third piece of evidence as well that Dan doesn't go into so much in the book. He's talked about elsewhere that began to intrigue me. My background, as we talked about in the previous episode, was looking at the Quran and oral tradition, and particularly how the Quran has been influenced by these other traditions, not just from the Bible, but other kind of Christian and Jewish traditions. Particularly, one of the things that a lot of scholars have talked about is how the Quran and early Islam were affected by and influenced by Syriac Christianity.
Now explain Syriac. Not many people know what you're talking about. Is this Syria the city? The country? The modern Syria that we're looking at today?
So Syriac means, the term Syriac Christianity is used to mean a number of things. But really, it really used in scholarship to refer to that particular form of Christianity that happened there at the top of Arabia, where all these countries meet in that little part of the world up there. And that was a form of Christianity that flourished round about sort of 400 through to about 600 AD. It produced literature, it produced scholarship.
So it's right around the time that Muhammad supposedly was born.
Around that formative time. And for example, I mentioned, for example, the story of Iblis and Adam in a previous episode. And I said that occurs in both Jewish traditions and occurs in Christian traditions.
Right.
One of the Christian traditions that it turns up in, there's a document called the Book of the Cave of Treasures that was very popular in Syriac Christianity. It was a collection of sort of pious stories and religious tales. It wasn't considered as scripture, it was just a sort of pious collection of tales. And lo and behold, the Christian version of that story occurs there. Now here's the thing, if all of that activity is happening there at the northern end of the Arabian Peninsula, how is it having such an influence on early Islam down here at the south? I mean, we can posit maybe things trickle along trade routes. That's possible. Maybe Muhammad travelled up on his early caravan trading adventures as a young man. That's possible. But it still seems quite a stretch to have that much influence at that much remove. Relocate the action north, relocate the foundings of Islam further north on the peninsula. Now things begin to look a bit more interesting. It's right at the heart of Syriac Christian territory, and we begin to think about that's why there's that influence there.
What we do know about Muhammad is, and what we, in fact, Montgomery Watt talked about the trade route theory, how that's what made Mecca important, all the trade. And we're going to put a map up there. You can see the map. If you look at the map, you'll see the west coast of India, and you'll see there's the Arabian Sea. And if you go up to, all the trade used to go up through the Persian Gulf, and then go across up to what is northern Iraq and over what is Syria today, over into the Mediterranean. That used to be the trade route. In that we do know that the Sassanids, the Persians, started warring with the Byzantines in the 5th century,
That's
up
right.
to 6, up to 7. So you had 200 years of warring back and forth, which shut down that trade route, and they had to redirect it then from the west coast of India, across the Arabian Sea, over to Aden. This is Montgomery Watt's theory, remember? Started to Aden, and then they go 1,250 miles along the western plateau, dip down to Mecca from Taif, then go back up from Mecca up to Yathrib, which is now to Medina, up to Tabuk, Khaybar, and then up to Gaza in the north. That's the trade route, and he made that famous. And everybody has jumped onto that theory as, so that's what made Mecca famous. Dr. Patricia Corona looked at that,
That's
and
right.
she came and destroyed that back in 1987 by saying, look at the map again. Why is Mecca not on the trade route? It's not on that western plateau.
It's not on that plateau.
It's down off about 1,000 meters.
It's a long way off to go. So why would you take, and we've got to think about, those great sort
caravans.
of caravans, huge numbers of camels.
All the way down there. Where there's no water.
Absolutely no water.
There's no known water source that's indigenous. Then you have to go all the way back up to get up to Yathrib. So she decided to go back and do a look at all this trade. And what did she find out?
Lo and behold, Mecca does not appear to be a stop on the ancient trade routes.
It's not even listed. She couldn't find any reference to it. More than that, she found out that the trade route that did go up the western plateau was just made out of milk and leather. But she did find out something that was interesting. The trade did get redirected. That was not in question. And if you take a look at the map again, you'll see what the answer is. Take a look at that waterway that goes up the west coast of Africa, the Red Sea. And what's fascinating is she went back to all the trading documents from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, up until the 7th century, and she noticed that they were not Arab. There were no names on any of these trading documents because they were not seafarers. Who was the name that came over and over again was Agilus in what is today Eritrea. It was the Ethiopians, the Eritreans that controlled that trade. The Arabs did not like to go on seafarers. There's no coastal cities there. They were nomadic, they were camel herders. They stayed into the deserts. They did not like the sea like your Africans. This is a huge misnomer. Now, why did Montgomery Watt not know that? Well, because he didn't do his
homework.
He didn't look at the documents. Dr. Patricia Corona reads and writes 15 languages. She can go back to the original sources and read them.
But here's where things get interesting, right? You put together, say, Patricia Corona's theories with someone like Gibson, and you go, what if? What if that actually Mecca was that stop on the trade route? But what if it isn't where Mecca is today? What if the holy city was somewhere else?
So now we're starting to get exciting.
Now we get exciting.
What if there is no Mecca? Okay, and that's what she looked at this because she wanted to find out. Well, then where does this Mecca come from? She looked at the trading documents coming from Ctesiphon. In fact, she noticed that there were silver mines outside of Yathrib, and these people from Ctesiphon would come across the desert, and they would have trade with the people from Taif. If you look at the map, Yathrib and Taif are very close together, but Mecca's in between. Why is it they don't mention Mecca? Not once.
Interesting, isn't it?
Fascinating. So she said, this is curious that no one mentions this city, Mecca.
Well, it's more curious as well if you bear in mind that on the Islamic narratives, of course, Mecca is the oldest of all cities. It was the city founded by Adam and Eve and then rebuilt by Abraham and his son. It's the mother of all cities. Surely it should have had this huge...
Certainly by 1900 BC, it should be some reference.
We're being told that the Kaaba has 360 idols and that people are coming from across the Arabian Peninsula to worship there, so presumably everybody should have known where it is.
And we've been told this all the time. Mecca was the center, the cradle of civilization. It was the oldest city, the greatest city, and certainly the center of trade, north, south, east, and west. Now, I'm going to put some maps up there. These are maps from the 7th century. Take a look at these maps and see if you can find Mecca on any of these maps. We'll just put a few up there. Take a look at this one. Now look at this one.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it?
These are 7th. What's missing? You can take it, but look at and see what you are finding. I'm going to put this one up now, which really shows the trade routes very carefully. You'll see Mecca's not there, but what city is at the center of all the trade routes?
Well, it's up in the north, isn't it?
And you've already mentioned it.
Petra.
Petra is at the center.
Now, there's a very good reason, of course, it was at the center.
Patricia Crone never talked about Petra. She always thought...
She was focused further down
Jerusalem.
south.
She thought it was Jerusalem. And in fact, we have the writings of Sabaeus. He says this in the 660s. He talks about the fact that the Saracens, these Arabs, are praying towards Jerusalem, towards the east. He's there in Alexandria, and he's referring to these Arabs who are praying towards, he thought was Jerusalem. He was off by 100 miles. Nonetheless, it's fascinating that even when I did my debate way back in my first debate with 2005, using Patricia Crone's material, 1995. 22 years ago with Dr. Jamal Badawi, I assumed it was Jerusalem, and many people have said, you've been incorrect, Jay, and I agree. I am.
And now the evidence is shifting.
Dan Gibson even says I've been incorrect.
Well, let's say a couple of things there, and then we'll come to the...
We're going to get to that.
We'll get to that, because that gets really juicy.
But I don't want to get off Mecca yet.
No, me neither. And what I was going to say is, I think what's interesting, just to return to Petra for a moment, of course, Petra, remember what civilization Petra was built by? The civilization that was their chief city, the Nabateans. And as
who are these?
And so as we've uncovered more and more information about the Nabateans, they were this incredibly powerful civilization that stretched, that had influence
from the 2nd century BC.
Yeah, with influence all across the Arabian Peninsula. They were trading up and down to places
like. Can you then see why all the trade routes go through?
Yeah, Petra. And here's the interesting thing as well, in terms of what really for me cinched some of Dan's thesis, and there's the Kibble information we're going to come to in a moment. I remember a few years ago, before I'd read Dan's book, I'd gone to Petra. I went there I was doing a speaking tour of the Middle East, and I had a couple of days off, and a friend said, hey, would you like to, we'll drive out and we'll go visit Petra? And incredibly impressive.
Was this before or after you read this book?
Before this. So to me, my first thought walking into Petra is, oh wow, it looks like Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Because they film there.
Are you following what he said there? There is this famous movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. It's the opening sequence or is it the last sequence?
It's one of the last sequences.
When he's coming through that very narrow kind of tract, there's walls on either side, and he comes out and you see a
narrow gorge opens, that's beautiful.
Treasury building.
Yeah,
that's just
incredibly beautiful city.
Into the rock.
And you can actually Google it. If people watching this, if you've never been to Jordan, just Google Petra, P-E-T-R-A, Petra, and then you'll get all kinds of beautiful images. And I remember when I read Dan's book, casting my mind back to that trip that my wife and I made to Petra, and I remember thinking, oh my. Because not merely is it in the right place in terms of the trading routes, the descriptions fit. It's got a river running through the middle of it.
In fact, have you just seen in the last few two months, they have now found water wells. They have now found caverns where waters were there in Petra. This is all new, which is again more support for what Dan's saying.
It had the agriculture. It was an incredibly important, sophisticated city. But here's the other thing. The thing that's amazing about Petra is, of course, it's a ruin. It was ultimately destroyed by earthquakes. But here's the thing. If you are a kind of slightly kind of sort of wild-haired prophetic type, wanting to talk about the way that God has cursed former civilizations and point to the great ruins around you. Well, there are none of those down south in Mecca. You preach that in the marketplace in Petra. My word, examples all around you. Because all of the cliffs in Petra are filled with these beautiful rock buildings. The Nabateans literally carved their buildings into the cliff.
These were
faces.
tombs. These were temples. This is
Tombs
a
and
sanctuary place for the Nabateans.
Exactly.
Amazing.
And so it begins to fit the geography. But it gets better still. And we're still going to come to the Qibla stuff in the remaining 8 minutes, which is a huge amount of fun. But the other thing as well that becomes interesting, there are other mysteries this solves. For example, scholars have long puzzled over the fact that when you dig into the Sirah Maghazi literature, that's the biographical information about Muhammad and the battles and the various things that were fought during his career, written in the sort of couple of hundred years after Muhammad's death. It's long puzzled scholars that there are lots and lots of accounts of incidents where, when Muhammad is relocated up to Medina, where the Meccans forces come and attack. And which direction do they attack from? They attack from the north.
From the north. No, wait a minute.
How does that...
Mecca's in the south.
Mecca's in the south. And you could literally see examples. Dan shows a couple of examples in his book of later Islamic scholars trying to sort of work out theories that maybe they sort of Meccans kind of marched their way around to sort of surprise them because they weren't expecting that direction. It's possible. It doesn't really fit when it happens time and time again. Relocate it and have the holy city being Petra makes perfect sense because when the Meccan armies want to finally rout that, crazy Muhammad character who caused all that trouble a few years before, well, of course, Medina lies to the south. So they march south and attack from the north. So huge bits of the Sirah Maghazi literature begin to make much more sense. And I think what finally... I'm 85% convinced by Dan. What finally brought me around to it was the way that when you read things this way, lots more makes sense. More of the Quran makes sense, more of the early Islamic histories makes sense. But there's one more sort of cherry on the top of all this, which I know we're itching to get to. You mentioned the word right at the top of the show without explaining what it was, Qibla. Tell people what the Qibla is.
Before we get to the Qibla, I just want to say one thing. I want to show some images of what Mecca looks like today. Have you seen modern images of Mecca?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Have you noticed all the building that's going on?
Building everywhere.
Cranes everywhere.
Yep.
You can see where Khadija's house has now been destroyed. A big superstructure has been put over top. Even Muhammad's maternal home has now been destroyed. The Zamarats, the three Zamarats, have now been rebuilt. Now, when you destroy buildings and you build large, tall superstructures,
I see where you're going, yes.
Including the fourth tallest building in the world, that big clock tower
yes.
that you can see right there. Take a look at that clock tower. And the 7 buildings all around it. What do you do to build tall buildings first?
Well, what you do when you're building tall buildings, right, is you dig deep.
Dig deep.
You need foundations.
And when you ever dig deep in, especially historical cities like in Amman or Jerusalem or Damascus, what do? You have archaeologists there.
You can't move for history. I mean, where we're
archaeologists have to be on site.
That's right. A very good contemporary example. Where we are filming this in London, not far from here, they've been building over the last few years a big rail project called Crossrail. They dig very, very deeply. They've had archaeologists on the team because everywhere they dig, they come up with Roman remains and
which is just 2,000 years old.
2,000 years old. Archaeology just pops out of the ground.
Therefore, goes back 1900 BC.
Well, put it this way:
the very beginning of
if
time.
the history of Mecca is as Muslims and the Quran has claimed, there should be stuff everywhere. Archaeology should be tumbling out of the ground.
Guess how much they found?
I don't know the exact figure, but I'm zero. I was going to say very little.
Found a thing.
Not an electric
There
sausage.
is no museum called the Mecca Museum with artifacts that go back even to Muhammad's time. Isn't that interesting? Can you now understand, this is my theory, can you understand why they are now cementing the entire place up?
Well, because you don't want people asking the difficult questions.
This archaeological problem is going to haunt them. If this is the oldest city in mankind,
why
haven't Muslims objected to this?
Well, it's funny, Jay, I've long joked that there are similarities, and this is a rabbit trail we won't go down, but I will at least flag it up. There are very interesting similarities between Islam and another modern religion, which is the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons.
Mormon religion.
Because they have a similar problem. They make all kinds of wild claims about American history.
We're not going to go into the Qibla now. We'll do that next. But
let's talk about this
parallels.
The parallel is this, right? So if viewers know anything about the Mormon faith, Joseph Smith, when he began preaching what became Mormonism, claimed that those Jewish tribes, the descendants of the children of Israel, came to America, right, settled, had great civilizations in America, and all kinds of goings on, battles and cities and amazing stuff. Well, it's one thing to claim that. The problem is there needs to be evidence. Yeah. And it's a huge embarrassment for the Mormon Church that there has been archaeological work done where there should be remains of battlefields and remains of cities and all kinds of things. Absolutely
Zilch.
Nothing. It's one of the biggest embarrassments for the Church of the Latter-day Saints.
Careful, my name is Joseph Smith.
I always think this, I always smile.
And I am a junior as well.
There we
Just like
go.
him.
And it's interesting.
And I do wear glasses.
It's certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, it's really begun to occur to me that I think Islam has exactly the same
There
problem.
are the parallels.
There are, because put it this way, if there was the information there in Mecca, and I were the Saudi authorities, I would be building museums, I'd be hosting documentaries, I'd be inviting National Geographic. Think of the witness, think of what it could do for Dawah, to bring the pagans there, show them, look what's here, and look what the Quran talks about. Nothing. And as you say, concreting it over, it's actually an embarrassment, so much so they're trying to sort of, get people not to look away, go elsewhere. And I think very, very interesting. Contrast that.
Even that long corridor between Marwa and Safa, those two supposedly hills going back and forth.
Contrast that, though, with Jerusalem. The amount of archaeological work that's been done there on Judaism, early Christianity, or that trip that I was describing where we went to Petra in Jordan. I remember, earlier in the week going and looking at some of the biblical sites there in Jordan. In fact, the Jordanians proudly telling me, saying, we've actually got more biblical sites here in Jordan than they have over there in Israel. That's another discussion. But they were happy to show you, come and look at this, and look at this, and look at this, because it's all there. You go to, you look at the equivalent for Islam.
It doesn't exist. Let's kind of just, before we go, in the next episode, we're actually going to then unpack Mecca, but we're going to go into the Qibla.
Good stuff.
But what I want to do is I just want to do a quick review of what we've just looked at. So, Andy, what you have said is you were skeptical to begin with.
Absolutely.
Because you've just assumed that the narrative, the classical model, the one that they're teaching in every school, in every seminary,
every school, every book you read,
there has been no reason for you to doubt this. People have started to come up with some problems. Patricia Crone came up with it. John Wansbrough came up with it. We do know that Michael Cook and others of the revisionist school, you've been skeptical of the revisionist school, but nonetheless, it was this book right here that really picked up your attention, because this man, though not a scholar, he was actually in situ. He wasn't reading books, he was actually living right there.
And I think you raised something very, very important there, actually, that sometimes it's very easy to do scholarship in a vacuum. Sometimes it's very easy, if you're a Muslim listener to this, to do your believing in a vacuum. You believe what your imams tell you, you believe how you're raised, you don't go out and check. And I think what impressed me about Dan was so much of that thesis grows out of actually going and living it on the ground. And when you go onto the ground and simply look around at what's there.
Learn the language,
learn the culture, and then go look.
Take the book with you.
And go look.
Look, and what he did is he just looked at these 65 geographical locations, and he said, I have a problem with these 65 geographical locations, because they should be there. There should be a valley, another parallel valley. There should be a stream going through it. There should be clay, loam, trees. There should be grass. There should be olive trees. Well, we don't see any of that in Mecca, and there never has been in that Mecca.
And then minor things running out of time, but one of my favorites he brings down to the book are those two mountains, right, that Muslims run between.
Marwa and Safa.
Exactly, when they're there on Hajj. I mean, if you've seen pictures of those, or if you're a Muslim watching this and you've been on Hajj, they're not mountains, they're tiny little bumps.
Yeah, that's right.
You go to Petra, my word, you can't move for mountains. Now, it makes much more sense. The two mountain summits in Mecca, those are an excuse for mountains. I'm a mountaineer. I wouldn't climb one of those and say I'd climb the mountain. It's a bump.
Well, I used to say that about Scafell coming from the Himalayas, so we won't get into that.
We'll get there later.
Listen, this has been great. It's been so good having you here, Andy. You can see what we're doing, and I know that some Muslims, you're going to start getting angry because of what we're seeming to imply. We're going to continue it with the next episode. We're going to unpack it. We're going to show you what Dan Gibson has found. We're going to look at some of the things that he is now coming up with. This is going to disturb your paradigm. This is going to disturb that narrative. But we've got to ask these questions. We've got to look at people who live in history, who say certain things and do certain things. Timelines. We've got to make sure that all of this fits. For the Bible, we have seen it fits in every case. We cannot say the same for the Quran. This is Jay and Andy here in London. Over and out.